Well, the last thing I'll say about Roma Dunze is I was never on that side of things because I was like, look at what the Bills are doing here. They're
Mm.
trying to, as much as I want a Roma Dunze, right? He would have been great as that stud wide receiver. And the Bills did have the capital, but I didn't think that they wanted to give that capital up because they traded Diggs. They're saving $28 million next year. They're admittedly trying to get younger. That's what Bean said on Sunday, that they knew that they had to get younger by getting rid of some of those older players. And I'm thinking they are trying to build for that second window of Josh Allen's career. Why would they want to give up a first and a second next year? So I think we'll cap it off right there with Odunze. But Izzy, bringing back you into this now, this is what I was proposing right along, that you use that second round pick that you acquired from the Stephon Diggs trade to move up to get Brian Thomas Jr. Because that way you're being semi aggressive. You're not selling the farm to go get a Dunze, but you're still getting someone who I thought was just a prototypical stud wide receiver who could be an immediate impact player here for Stephon Diggs as Josh Allen's wide receiver one. And he could be his running mate for the next 5 to 10 years as long as you can extend them. And that would ride out with the rest of Josh Allen's career. So I said, you know what? That way you still have a first, you still have a second next year. But as long as you have that extra second, why not just try to move 6 spots up, trade with Philly at 22, and try to snag Brian Thomas before someone else does? And sure enough, Jacksonville took him at 23. So the more I thought about it, I was like, I don't know, is that a little bit too rich? Would you rather trade day 3 picks? But I was like, still, like, I don't think I want to back off that because I said right from the beginning, use that extra second that you got from Diggs to replace that wide receiver one with the new wide receiver one. It's essentially an even draw. So, Izzy, would you have subscribed to that? Would you have given up that extra second to try to get Brian Thomas? I know you just said that you were team trade back, but does that all at all entice you?
So for the reasons that you said, no, because I don't see him as a wide receiver one yet. I don't have enough information about the prospect in order to decide that he's a wide receiver one. The route tree, I still don't know anything about other than the 4 or 5 routes that he ran in college. I don't know if he's going to be able to run the full NFL route tree. And the Bills like to use the entire NFL route tree. Gabe Davis struggled with a lot of that route tree. And so I think that going after who they went after, they still got the size and the contested catch ability of Brian Thomas, but without the cost that it would take. I don't think they want to give up that second round pick next year. Next year is supposed to be another stacked draft with weapons. And, they tend to draft a running back every year or every other year. They tend to draft, offensive linemen in the third, fourth, and sometimes second round. I think they're probably done with the whole second round offensive lineman thing. That hasn't really worked for them, but the third round's been pretty good to them. The last second round offensive lineman that worked for him was Deion Dawkins. So when I'm looking at the pattern in which that they like to operate, the weapons that they get are usually second rounders that work out. James Cook, for example, they like to go forward with as many assets as they can. So that way, next year, if they can move forward, they will. But I wasn't really a BTJ guy either. I wasn't a Keon Coleman guy. I was on once we let go of Diggs. The next closest thing to Diggs in this draft to me was Ladd McConkey, and he went one pick after we went, which let me know that what I thought was potentially the plan was not the plan. They didn't want that type of receiver anymore. They're looking for something different. And so at that point, I submitted the fact that I don't know where this offense is going.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know what the hell they want. And so because of that, I just I just took my brain and I said, you know what, unplug and just let it happen.
I'm glad you said that because I wanted to hit on that after this last point that I make here. So I agreed with the trade down with Kansas City. As much as it stung to trade with your arch nemesis here, I was like, okay, you know what? You get a 3rd-round pick. And that 3rd-round pick ended up being Dwayne Carter, who's a defensive tackle. And oddly enough,
the captain.
Yeah. But aside from that, what has been the bugaboo here holding the Bills back in the playoffs? They haven't been able to get pressure on Patrick Mahomes. And I was like, man, that could be a good omen that Kansas City gave you. As much as we're saying we gave Kansas City Xavier Worthy, well, they gave us a defensive tackle who potentially can get pressure to get Mahomes down in the playoffs now.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be another way of looking at it. So I was fine with that trade. The one that got me, though, and I know you guys talked about him, Xavier Legette. I mean, he was right there at 32.
That's your
and
guy.
He was my guy. And they essentially gave him to Carolina. Now, I understand that was a very good value trade because they were able to get a 5th-round pick out of it just to move 1 spot back. and they did save $3.2 million on the cap now that they don't have to have that first round wide receiver. So I think it was a smart business move, but that tells me that Keon Coleman was their guy all the way. So I was really questioning why they didn't like Xavier Legette after they had him in on that private workout. They talked him up a lot. Josh Allen mentioned his name. He was a media darling, at least on Twitter. So let's just speak on Xavier Legette real quick before we get into and finally finish Keon Coleman here. So, did that bum you guys out? Did you want Legette at 32 like I did?
Yeah, I mean, during the live cast, we definitely said that Legette was an option there, and that is who I thought they were. I said that's who I think the Bills want, and that's who I think they're going to pick today, whether it's at 28 or 32 or wherever. That's who I thought they were going after. So when they made that initial trade down, I'm like, oh, see, you can have Xavier Worthy. We got a 3rd round pick, and we're still getting our guy. And we talked about
that. We'll take the other Xavier.
Live. Right? Exactly. But I think ultimately what it came down to with Legette is a couple of things, right? Well, we don't know. We're speculating. It could be the skill set. Maybe they didn't want that kind of guy, but you could argue Coleman and him are similar in some of those ways. So I would say the big thing to me, what stood out was the consistency wasn't quite there, right? It was only the 1 year coming on. He faced a lot of inferior opponents that the teams beat up on when he had his good games. And ultimately the age factor, right? So Keon Coleman's a lot younger, 21. More experience in terms of, starting and playing and consistently at that level. I watched some of his tape from his first year in college, which I guess was, like 3 years ago. When was he at Michigan State? Anyway, that was, you could see some flashes even then. And now you look at him and he's stronger, bigger build, obviously, as he grew. And I think that's ultimately the Bills saw that projection and his age and his development going forward and said, this is a better curve for me to be on than a Legette who kind of came here and now he might have reached his ceiling, right? Because he peaked. He jumped. He didn't incline. He jumped, right? And maybe that's what scared them away. That's, again, speculation on why they didn't go Legette, because I really thought going into the day that is who they wanted, and that was the skill set they wanted. That was the body type they wanted. That was who Josh Allen wanted. But it turns out half of that wasn't even true, right? So the other part I wanted to go back to, by the way, I mentioned that because those offensive picks were all 15 in a row, defensive guys fell. Brandon Beane probably called Philly, like you said, and said, hey, man, I'll give you next year's second. I'll give you the second we inherited, Minnesota's second, which is going to be a high second, to come up and get our guy, BTJ. That's who I wanted, remember? And Beane, but the problem was Philly said, yeah, that sounds really nice, but following the Philadelphia Eagles, what was one of their biggest fallbacks on the season? They couldn't tackle. They had terrible cornerback play at times, right? So they needed to upgrade that without a doubt. And they did in the first 3 rounds, right? So, but that pick was Quinyon Mitchell, the best dang cornerback in this draft by most people's standards. So, yeah, 1 or 2. So that's what I mean. You called Philly and they were like, there's nothing you can give us to not take this pick. This guy's making our team better. If we don't take him, Jacksonville's right behind us. They're going to take him. So we have to take him, right? And so I think that's ultimately what happened. And same thing with the next call and the next call, or whatever other calls they took. Obviously, BTJ went off the board. But I do think maybe they were trying to also call up about one of the edge players, a Jared Verse or whatever. They wanted some of those guys. Verse went earlier. But, still, they wanted some of those guys. Let's say they had 5 guys that they're like, these are the guys we're willing to trade up for. They just couldn't make it happen because of the way the board fell on draft night. Those teams that were in the trade range were just getting their guy too. So not to go off the rails and back up a little bit, but I wanted to get that in because I do think that's important. Beane probably did make that call for BTJ and said, this is right where we thought we could get him. If we trade with you, we'll give up our 2 next year and we're in great position. We get our guy, but it just couldn't happen. And then Jacksonville ultimately took him. And that was probably the end of the first round grades for Beane because he said he only had 20 something first round grades. It wasn't 28. So we knew then he was trying to trade down and he did. But yeah, so there's a lot with Xavier Legette versus Keon Coleman that I think, again, we're only speculating, but I think those factors that I mentioned in the beginning of this might have come into play. The age, the experience, the overall contribution. I thought they were going Leggett. I thought they were avoiding Coleman because, to me, he's also high risk, right? He's high reward, but also high risk. And all offseason leading up to this, or since January, Eric and I on our podcast, he's going to get the chance tomorrow night on the hoof to give his feedback. But I can tell you, he was die-hardy Keon Coleman guy, and he was bitching his butt off after night 1 of the draft. And I told him, we're going to end up getting your guy, Keon Coleman, that you've been begging for the Bills to take in round 1, if not trade up for. And sure enough, that's ultimately what happened. And the reason he was all for Coleman was because of the skill set. He felt like just the big body, the hands, was better than any of the wide receivers. But to me, again, that risk of Coleman only going off what people who know football better than I do say, right? They watched the tape and said, he's too much of a risk. He can't get open. So I said, take him off the Bills board, because the one thing the Bills cannot do is miss with a guy who has 50% chance to not be that guy. I want a guy who's 80% chance to be good and 20% chance, of course, there's always a risk. And I felt that BTJ was that level, right? Contribute now, plenty of growth. I honestly believe he will be a 1 in this league. He's going to have the growth pattern. He can contribute now with his speed down the field. I was much more on the BTJ or nothing train when Diggs was still around, because I felt like that was the true receiver we needed to complement Diggs. And that would have been the perfect pairing. Once we got rid of Diggs, it was more of, I have no idea what Bean is doing right now, so he's got to go get the guy that his skill set is. And Brady, too. We have to bring Brady into this conversation of evaluating players and saying, that's the guy I want in my offense, and right now I don't have this skill set in my offense. So I think that was also a factor in the Coleman decision.
Again, I'll just try to keep this quick. I thought that Xavier Leggett was everything that Keon Coleman is, but then he has that freakish athleticism and that speed to him, where I thought he was, I don't want to say a clone, but I saw him as like the future AJ Brown and DK Metcalf combined into one. And I was like, this guy just seems like a freak that you would want to get in your offense because he can do so many things. And I think Joe Brady would be able to work with him really well because you can get that yak from him. And I guess transitioning to Keon Coleman now, that's one of the knocks on him. I mean, he can get the yak, but like you guys said, the biggest knock was that he doesn't have that speed and he can't separate. So I thought if Joe Brady wants a wide receiver, you want a guy who has speed and can separate and can get open at will, because it just doesn't seem like this is a Joe Brady type of wide receiver where it's like, hey, we're going to throw you a 50-50 ball and we're hoping that we're going to use your height and you can use your basketball background and your ball skills to try to come down with this. It just doesn't seem like that's what Buffalo Bills offense has come to. But I guess my rebuttal to that would be, well, they did sign Curtis Samuel. Let's not forget. They do have Khalil Shakir and they do have other pieces, but I don't know. So Izzy, going back to you now, what are your thoughts on that? Just passing on Xavier Leggett, going with that bigger guy in Keon Coleman. And while you do that, I do have his RAS score here that we can pull up, because Xavier Leggett had a 9.9 RAS, which is one of the best scores in history since RAS became official in 1987.
Did he do all the pieces of it, though? Some of those guys skipped certain portions in their RAS calculation.
I'm not sure. I can check while Izzy's talking here.
Yeah,
I remember hearing that.
Keon Coleman didn't do the agility stuff. I know that he had a 9.12. So
right. Yeah.
That's cool with me. Keon Coleman is a body control wide receiver. He's a guy who's going to go up there and he's going to contort himself in whichever way is necessary to keep his opponent away from the ball and put himself in position to catch the ball. That's what I saw on tape at Florida State. I really enjoyed the tape once we got the pick, and I knew it wasn't my guy, and I had to see if I could find anything that was, to love about the guy. And the fact that he boxes people out, it reminds me a lot of Keenan Allen. I like the way he plays and his subtle route changes. He does get separation. He doesn't get a lot of it, though. And so when you have that much of a wingspan and you have that much of a catch radius, I think that the separation thing is a little bit overblown now that I've watched an extended amount of tape. I didn't watch as much tape as I would pre-draft until after we get the guy. And now he's my business, right? He's not like, if they're not somebody I'm looking at the Bills drafting, like Keon Coleman wasn't one of those guys. I watched some tape on him, and it was like, all right, decent, but later in the draft. Once he is now somebody that I need to focus on because he's a Bill, and I actually sat down and I broke down what I saw and extended him out. Like that LSU game, he was murdering LSU. Like that was like he took them apart nearly single-handedly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Travis just needed to put the ball up there, and Keon Coleman was just dominant against Syracuse, which I actually watched that game live because I'm a Syracuse fan, and I was hoping that we'd win that game, and we did not. We did not win that game. We got destroyed. And just that catch up across the middle, and then his explanation of how he does those things. And he basically said, when the ball's in the air and I go up and go get it, I black out. And basically what's going to happen is going to happen. That whole let it come to you mentality is something that the Bills, I believe, covet because they don't want you thinking. They want you reacting. That's something that Sean McDermott's harped on since he's been here. I don't want these guys thinking. I want these guys reacting naturally. It's like, I don't know if you guys are Dragon Ball fans or not, but, he goes into ultra instinct when it's time to catch that football. He's just up there. That's mine. Yoink. Thank you. And whatever happens once I hit the ground, I'm back in my thoughts. But until then, it's me, my hands, hand-eye coordination, and that's it. There's no thought process. Make it happen. And I love that response that he gave. Like, I really don't know what happens when I get up there. And I think that's one of the problems with Gabe Davis. He thought about it a little too much.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, Keon Coleman is not a replacement for Stephon Diggs. He is a replacement for Gabe Davis. And if you look at him that way, he is an improvement over Gabe Davis.
Mm-hmm. To add to that, too, it carries through his feet, which I don't think with Gabe was the thing. He catches with his hand, but it carries through with the next motion he has to make. He can get the yak after he makes the catch just based on where his body is and that body control that you mentioned. It carries through to his feet. From his hands to his feet, he catches the ball, he makes a move with the ball, and that was what I noticed on tape too.
So he uses the ball, his catch point, and which direction the ball and he are moving to decide where his feet are going next.
Exactly.
So caught it over here, need to drag this foot through, and then I can keep running up the field.
And the fact that that's instinct is what's impressive, right?
It
just happens. Yeah.
The last thing that I'll say about Keon Coleman, as much as I just said, that Keon Coleman doesn't seem like a Joe Brady type of receiver because he's that big body, go up and make the tough contested catch. He's not the speed separator or that savvy route runner like a Ladd McConkey. Like we were thinking going into Friday, I was like, even I was thinking, I wonder if the Bills are going to get McConkey here because he does seem like a Joe Brady type of receiver. But on the flip side, you can make an argument that this is a Joe Brady receiver because, to Izzy's point, I think of him as an upgraded version of Gabe Davis because he's physical and he can help in the run blocking game. So then I got to thinking, I wonder if this is a tell that the Bills offense is going to continue to do what they did well at the end of last year and not make Josh Allen drop back 50 times. And instead, they're going to get the run game going. And James Cook is going to be a factor. Aaron Kromer is going to coach up the offensive line, especially with the draft picks that they selected on Saturday. So as much as Keon Coleman doesn't seem like a wide receiver in a Joe Brady offense, he really might be the perfect receiver because he gives an added element that I don't think some of the other receivers had.